government, just before Easter, came out with a new roadmap and relaunched this competition to build demonstrations and get CCS on the road, as it were. We've really highlighted 4 dilemmas for policies, four things that actually need quite a lot of attention if they're going to actually make these plans successful. So at the moment, even though they've relaunched the demonstration competition, it's still a set of plans and a roadmap. It is not a firm commitment to build particular plans. So generally, I think looking at history, the good news, if you're looking for good news, is uncertainty can be resolved. In many of our cases, we found that technologies, we looked for technologies where these uncertainties were resolved, of course. So flue gas desulfurization was scaled up rapidly in the 1970s, partly due to industry ingenuity, partly due to policy push and the right policy framework, and that was done. And that technology is now ubiquitous throughout the world and very common and commercially available. Another example we might give is in France, when they were thinking about what kind of reactor to build in the nuclear program in the 1960s. They took a punt on basically a design, the pressurized water reactor, which in the end ended up being quite successful. They built 40 odd of them. They are expensive, but on some terms they were successful in making a decision under uncertainty about what type of variant to go for, which is very similar to the position for CCS today. Landfill projects have been financed, and we've dealt with the insurance arrangements and so on. So we found lots of areas where uncertainties have been resolved. Secondly, we shouldn't look at them in isolation. I think policy looks at these things in piecemeal fashion. You look at the technology over here, you look at the economics over here, but actually it matters how they interact. So policy to push too far too fast on one particular type of CCS, like it tried to do in the first demonstration. It said you can have money for a demonstration, but it's got to be a coal plant, it's got to be this technology, it's got to be this size. I'm really not surprised it didn't work, because at the time there was so much uncertainty about many of these factors, so I'm really not surprised we are where we are. I remember saying at the time this was a mistake, and they should have included many more options on the table. So pushing too far too fast and closing down options can actually end up slowing you down in the end. But also that not all uncertainties need to be fully resolved. It's not like government has to go around dealing with everything in order for this to happen. I think there's a temptation that the government must do everything, but actually industry does live with uncertainty some of the time with technology and can take risks. I think we need to leave space for that. So that's the general. On to the more specific, we've got these 4 dilemmas as government actually goes forward with this demonstration programme. The first one is the keeping options open point I've already mentioned. So I'm really pleased, and I think it chimes with our evidence from our report, that the government is keeping options open on which technologies developers can now bid into the new competition to use, and fuel as well. So they can do coal or gas, they can use different types of carbon capture technology. You can have a tour of a plant at post-combustion, but there's other options out there, and I think it really makes sense to keep options open and do that, so that you avoid these backlashes and really learning from past mistakes. So I think that's good. And although I mentioned the French nuclear example where they took a risk, it was a big risk, and in that case it paid off, but I think it's too early to take that sort of risk with CCS right now. And I think our evidence kind of shows that. The second one is getting the economic incentives right. There's been £1 billion on the table for quite a long time for CCS from Treasury. It survived the financial crisis, it survived all the cuts, quite surprisingly I think to some of us. But as the Longana failure showed before Christmas, it's not enough to get a plant built. So the new package for government is not only having the £1 billion from taxpayers, but actually designing contracts which in the end will mean us as consumers will pay more for our electricity to pay for CCS plants, renewable plants, nuclear plants. That's got to be part of the picture too. And the key challenge I think for government is to make all that package work together and coordinate it. And talking to developers, they're still not entirely convinced that all that can be brought together in order to make it a financeable proposition for them, all told. The third point we'd make, which in the press release says CCS is a marathon, not a sprint, is really referring to the point that many new technologies, if you look at history, take a long time to develop and deploy, and we don't have time. So what basically CCS is trying to compress timescales of the 20 to 30 year timescale that technologies often take. If you look at wind or solar, or say nuclear technology and many others, the timescales can be very long. We're trying to compress it, and because we're trying to compress it, that might actually exacerbate some of the problems. And one problem that may occur, we found from some of our examples, is that costs actually rise to start with, and then perhaps will fall eventually if you're patient enough. And we refer, for example, to flue gas desulfurization in the US, where costs rose fivefold and then subsequently fell. And it was because of unforeseen technical problems in scaling up and so on. So I don't think government can expect that just because they're going to support demonstrations and get them up and running, everything's going to go well, they're all going to work swimmingly, costs will be what the industry say they're going to be, they may rise. But I think our general point is that's not necessarily a reason to give up, but it may be a reason to keep a really close eye on that and say, actually, at some point, if those costs are refusing to go over time, do we actually cut our losses and put investment into other options? So it's really the call we're making is for government to have that capacity and not just rely on the industry to tell them what costs are going to be. There will be obviously issues perhaps along the way. But finally, and I'll hand over to Stuart on this point, is the liabilities regime is very important. Once we're storing CO2 underground, even offshore, of course, there are still some risks, whether they're perceived or real, things like leakage. Somebody's got to look after that site for many years to come, long after developers will have perhaps handed it back to the state. So what we're saying is there needs to be quite a clear sense of what the sharing of those liabilities and risks are between the public sector and the private sector. Because history of things like nuclear, landfill, other areas show, in the end, the public sector and taxpayers end up